The first case to come before us this morning is State of Ohio versus James Williams. Both sides will have 15 minutes to present oral argument. The appellant may reserve up to 5 minutes for rebuttal. I'm presiding today, so that I'm keeping track of the time. If you let me know if you want to reserve any time for rebuttal when you get started, I can assist you in keeping track of whether or not you're into your rebuttal time. Excuse me. Please don't use the names of any victims or minors as we are recording this video oral argument and posting it on the court's website. We have read the briefs and we are ready to proceed when you are.
Thank you, Your Honors. Lindsay Poprocki on behalf of the State of Ohio. I'd like to reserve 5 minutes for rebuttal. This is a state's appeal challenging the trial court's decision to grant James Williams judicial release. Following a bench trial, Williams was found guilty of multiple drug-related offenses, which included 1 count of possession of cocaine and 1 count of trafficking of cocaine, which each carried major drug offender specifications. Ultimately, the trial court sentenced Williams to a total of 12 years in prison. The primary issue in this case is whether the entire 12-year sentence on those counts was mandatory. Because the answer to that question is yes, the state submits that Williams was not an eligible offender for purposes of judicial release and that the trial court erred in granting his motion. As the court is aware, to be an eligible offender under RC 292920, an individual must be serving a stated prison term that includes 1 or more non-mandatory prison terms. The state submits, however, that Williams was serving entirely mandatory prison terms at the time he filed his motion for judicial release. A review of the language contained in both the drug trafficking and possession statutes at the time of Williams' offenses shows that he was sentenced in conformity with those statutes and that his entire 12-year sentence was mandatory. The actual language contained in those statutes is critical for this court's appellate review. I'm going to read some of that language here that states that if the amount of the drug involved exceeds 1,000 grams of cocaine, the court shall impose a mandatory prison term. As a mandatory prison term, the maximum prison term prescribed for a felony of the 1st degree, and may impose an additional mandatory prison term prescribed for a major drug offender. At the time of Williams' offense, the maximum prison term for a felony of the 1st degree was 10 years. Therefore, the trial court was required to impose a mandatory 10-year sentence for the underlying trafficking and possession of cocaine offenses in counts 2 and 3. The sentencing entry of the trial court confirms that it did so. As provided by the plain language of the statutes, the trial court had the discretion to impose an additional mandatory prison term because Williams was a major drug offender. The sentencing entry of the trial court confirms that it elected to do so. The sentencing entry also shows that it contains an express order that Williams sentenced for the 2 counts 2 and 3, which both included the prison term for the underlying offenses themselves and the additional prison term imposed for the major drug offender specifications, are mandatory. The state submits that Williams was not an eligible offender for judicial release as the sentences imposed for counts 2 and 3 consisted of wholly mandatory time, and therefore he was not serving a stated prison term that included non-mandatory prison time at the time he filed his motion for judicial release. The state is cognizant of Williams' argument that the language in the former statutes can be interpreted in multiple ways, but the state respectfully disagrees with this argument and asks that this court not add or delete words into the statute that do not exist. The state also has a secondary argument in arguing that the trial court failed to make necessary statutory findings under RC 2929.20J, and that it failed to state those specific findings on the record as to whether a non-prison sanction would adequately punish Mr. Williams or demean the seriousness of his offense. Williams does not dispute that the court was required to make these findings, but states that these findings were specifically made in the journal entry and that those were sufficient. Again, the state disagrees. And here there were no findings on the record as to these factors. The sentencing entry contains a verbatim just verbatim language of the statute, but there were no findings made on the record, and it's that this court cannot rely basically on the journal entry to support findings that were not made on the record. At this time, I would reserve the remainder of my time.
Thank you, counsel. You'll have 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Counsel?
Yes, good morning. I'm all turned around. Giovanna Bremke on behalf of Mr. James Williams. As the state notes, this is unique. This is a state appeal. There's a long procedural history that this court is likely aware because it's been before you previously on a couple different occasions, actually. But now we are here on this judicial release motion that was granted by the trial court. I would point the court to the sentencing entry, which is attached to my brief, obviously, and noting that the court ordinarily speaks through its entry. And that's essentially what the trial court also considered, is that there was no intent by the original sentencing judge, who wasn't the judicial release judge, to impose a mandatory term on those additional specifications. There is, however, a mandatory on count 2 and 3, and it says that in several different areas. So it was clear in regard to those that there was a mandatory term on those. Mr. Williams served that 10 years. Served an additional 6 months, and then was eligible for the judicial release. He was released, and he's been doing well since. Our state's argument is, well, regardless of what the trial court put in their entry, that there was no discretion. And what you'll see, and what the dissent in this court had previously noted, that the statute is not clear. And when the statute's not clear, there's only one way to interpret that, and that's in favor of Mr. Williams. So the brief, my brief goes through the 3 different interpretations, one being the state's interpretation, one being the way that I would ask that you interpret it, and that's that the trial court had discretion about those additional specifications being mandatory or non-mandatory, and it's clear that that the trial court did not put that in the entry. And then a third interpretation. Again, we would ask that you interpret it in favor of Mr. Williams, as the law requires when there's a vague statute, and affirm the trial court's decision on the judicial release. There's also the state's second assignment of error in regards to the findings. Again, if you review the trial court's entry on the judicial release, this is the second entry, I guess, that I'm talking about. It's clear that the trial court puts in there that those findings were made. Again, the court speaks through its entries, and that's proper. So again, we would just ask that you affirm the judicial release. Mr. Williams, again, has been out now for about over 2 years, while this has been pending back and forth in this court. And he has served his mandatory time, the 10 years and 6 months. The trial court found that not only is he eligible, that he was a great candidate. He had never had any major sanctions. I don't know that he had any in his whole 10.5 years in prison, which is remarkable. And he, again, has been doing excellent since. Justice requires that trial court's decision is affirmed, and that's what I would ask you to do. Any questions?
Counsel, I note from the trial court's entry that his community control sanction is set to terminate in beginning of October of this year. Do you know if that has changed at all?
Yes, I do. I can tell you an update. He was placed on PRC, and in Michigan, in that court has that agency has asked since like 6 months into this to terminate him, because he's been great, always reported, never tested positive. He's been a great ideal, basically, on probation. He's working, he's a productive member of society, and he doesn't want to go back. The trial court has not done that
Okay.
because this has been pending.
Okay, thank you. Seeing no other questions, thank you, Attorney Bramke. Attorney Paprocki, you have 5 minutes for rebuttal.
I would like to take the court back to the issue before the court, which is whether James Williams was an eligible offender at the time he filed his motion for judicial release. And that turns on whether he was serving a non-mandatory prison term at the time of his motion. And the state would again assert that the time that he was serving at the time was mandatory. And that turns on the interpretation of the statute under which he was sentenced. And the state would submit that there's no need to interpret that statute as to the intent, because that statute was clear and unambiguous. That statute, under any argument that the trial court had discretion to impose either a mandatory or a non-mandatory sentence as additional prison term on the major drug offender specification, is unsupported under a plain reading of the statute. Rather, under the plain reading of the statute, a trial court is permitted but not required to impose an additional mandatory prison term for major drug offenders. The trial court's discretion, therefore, rests in whether to impose the prison term on the major drug offender specification, not on whether such prison term should be mandatory or non-mandatory. The discretion is whether to impose the time, not on whether the time is mandatory or non-mandatory. The phrase mandatory prison time is clear and unambiguous. The statute at issue makes no reference to a non-mandatory prison term, which is defined in the code as a prison term that is not mandatory, nor does the statute reference any option to impose such a term. The statute expressly references an additional mandatory prison term. As noted previously in my argument, the court is not permitted to insert words or requirements into a statute that simply do not exist. The state would simply argue that Williams was under a mandatory prison term. The trial court sentenced Mr. Williams in conformity with that statute. The trial court's conformity with that statute was confirmed in its sentencing entry, and the trial court, when granting Williams' motion for judicial release, erred in doing so, and we would ask that its decision be reversed.
Thank you both for your arguments today. The court will take the matter under advisement. We will issue a decision which will be mailed to all parties to this appeal, as well as posted on the Ohio Supreme Court website.